one of the trickiest topics to teach. It takes a while to grasp, really, because this is where the complexity of the pharmacology really ramps up. In the past, I used to stick with the lock and key model when teaching about the various, I'd go through it by receptor, and okay, antipsychotics bind to 15 plus receptors, but I realized it did not give a very accurate picture and did lead to misconceptions down the line with regards to clinical properties of each individual antipsychotic. So I'm going to borrow from one of the psychiatrists on the subreddit for psychiatry, who also borrowed from another blog post a nice analogy to describe second generation, third generation, basically after first gen onwards, pharmacology using a fountain analogy. Of course, we're doing Munchlax, so it has to be a chocolate fountain. Stock photo, not mine, but good enough for purposes. Another thing that will really help for this is the song from NEI Psychofarm. The pins, the don'ts, two pips and a rip. How can you tell which one is which? Because there are so many, right? Pins, the don'ts, two pips and a rip. Thankfully, we don't have to do all of them, but even with the ones we have here, there are so many. And it can be very tempting to study them as one homogeneous category. These are all second gen antipsychotics, so they're of all this, that clinical properties. They're all the same? No. Okay. Here is the very important thing when studying second gen, third gen antipsychotics. You have to, as early as now, treat them as unique individual drugs with different properties from each other. I mean, study them as drug A, B, C, D. Risperidone is different from quetiapine, is different from olanzapine, lalo na different from clozapine. Treat them as individual drugs with some similarities, and well, it will be a headache at first, but once you start applying, it'll become less difficult because your foundations are a lot more solid than second gen. They're all like this, okay? And that's very wrong, because when you go through even the basic pharmacology, the mechanism, you understand how very different they really are, okay? So how exactly does the song go? Well, the key thing, first of all, when we talk about so-called antipsychotic efficacy, is that you need to block at least 60% of D2 receptors. Now, first generation antipsychotics, at the doses they're used, usually they end up tending to block about 80 or more percent. Now, that won't really change the efficacy. What ends up happening is you have a lot more side effects, particularly if you overblock D2 receptors, say, particularly at the nigrostriatal pathway. I mean, in that pathway, you're not supposed to be blocking any D2 receptors in the first place, but again, we have no choice where our D2 receptor antagonism in our brain will go, right? So if you exceed 60% there, that's where the EPS really comes in. If you exceed the 60% block in the tuberoinfundibular pathway in the anterior pituitary, okay, that's where the prolactin elevation will start coming in. Okay, so how does second and third gen differ in that respect? Well, some, not all. So how do some of the second and third gens differ in that respect? The key there lies in the other receptors. And well, as you can see behind me, if you check out stalls, they bind to a lot, really. But we're gonna go at it one receptor at a time. Okay, let's start with one receptor at a time. So how does the song go? The next part of the song from NEI Psychofarm goes all of it. I have to position myself accordingly. Okay, here's the dash line. All of the receptors that you see to the right compared to compared to D2, where's the dash line? They don't bind very tight. This is D2. So when you dose a drug to block D2, the effects of these receptors will be very few. What does that mean? Okay, so I mentioned earlier, you want at least a 60% D2 receptors in particularly in the mesolimbic pathway blocked for minimum antipsychotic effect. But does it mean that when I administer, 1 milligram of drug X, I'll automatically get that? Of course, it'll depend on how potent, right, each drug is. But when I administer 1 milligram of a drug, is that going to spread out evenly across all these receptors? If I were to teach using just the lock and key model, it might look like, well, yes, because, this drug, say olanzapine, it binds to all of these receptors, right? So like, okay, so 1 milligram, you might think using just this model, it will distribute evenly to like all of these 15 plus receptors. But that's not the case, because our drugs have favorites. Based on what? Based on their affinity. Yeah, our drugs will have favorites. So depending on, again, the individual drug. In this case, olanzapine, its favorites will be, sorry, wrong hand. Let's move myself up here so you can see. I'm going to block off like the lock and key because that's going to be confusing for you. Let's focus on the chocolate fountain model. Its favorites will be the histamine and 5-HT2A receptors. Meaning, if I throw 1 milligram of olanzapine at the person, they take it. Of that 1 milligram, a huge chunk is really going to go to the H1 receptors because again, olanzapine has its favorites and also the 5-HT2A receptors. As I keep increasing the dose, olanzapine will preferentially still be staying here at the top layer with its favorites. The receptors it has more affinity to. Does it mean that there is zero olanzapine at the receptors it is not favorites at? Well, olanzapine kind of drugs, they have to maintain some facade of fairness. But, it's very clear they have favorites, but it doesn't mean they won't bind to the other receptors even at low doses. That's a misconception there. Think of it like you're pouring chocolate at the top of the fountain, yes, but the chocolate will still splash. So a bulk of the olanzapine will still be here at its favorites first. You start at the low doses, but while it splashes, some of it might drift to its less favorite receptors. But still, before it will start rushing or crowding the other receptors, it will first fill up its favorites. So for example, I increase to 2, 3, 4 milligrams. Eventually, it will start filling up. It'll start filling up its favorite receptors. And once those are filled up, the chocolate will then overflow and fall to its next tier of favorite receptors. Yeah, as you increase the dose. And so on, until again, our goal is we fill up D2, at least 60% of D2. Yeah, we have to fill up 60% of D2. And then, of course, beyond that point, there isn't really any. We've seen this with dose response meta-analyses. Generally speaking, once you hit 60% of D2, you won't get any additional benefit going beyond that usually. Okay? For a majority of cases, you usually won't get anything. So usually you just want to stop here. Again, even at the therapeutic dose, it doesn't mean, for example, okay, I've hit 60% of D2 receptor blockade. It doesn't mean I won't see any olanzapine here at these receptors. There will be a little, because again, chocolate likes to splash around. But when you talk about what receptors are filled up, it will be these first. These will be filled up, and then that before we hit D2. So when the song goes, all of these receptors okay, this will be better now. That you see to the right, compared to D2, they don't bind very tight. And then the next one, so when you dose a drug to block D2, so first it'll start filling up its favorite receptors. Yeah, fill up, and then increase the dose. These receptors will be filled up, and then you start hitting 60% D2 receptor blockade. Then that means once you hit 60%, okay, you can stop. There will be some olanzapine here, but not enough. That's why the effects of these receptors will be very few. Okay, so hopefully the chocolate fountain analogy is starting to click a little. But if you would like another more detailed explanation, I'll link the video below from Psychofarm. And after that, the line goes, D2 in conventionals ain't very special because, when you say conventionals or the so-called first generation antipsychotics, yeah, it's just blocking D2 receptors. And then the next part of the song, adding 5-HT2A. There. Adding 5-HT2A to the left. Okay, I remember the lyrics. to the left is essential because you want, what is with 5-HT2A exactly? When we talk about second gen, third gen, I mentioned some of them have less EPS risks than with first gen. And that is because of the 5-HT2A receptor. And also partly 5-HT1A. But I'll go into detail in a bit why that's the case. But if this is the receptor that can lead to a reduction in EPS, then you'd want, when you talk about mechanism, you would want your drug to have a higher affinity for 5-HT2A, particularly the antagonist of 5-HT2A, as compared to D2. So once you dose the drug to block 60% of D2 receptors, there is some guarantee that at least the 5-HT2A receptors in the part of the brain you want blocked are blocked fully, or at least close to fully, right? The reason why, we'll get to that in a bit. I don't want to overload you in one slide, but yeah. Adding 5-HT2A to the left meaning more affinity than D2, is essential for EPS and prolactin to be low or gone. Yes, as you would expect, antipsychotic affinities for the various receptors will differ. So for instance, okay, let's again cover up this lock and key model. For risperidone, you will see that in terms of, compared to, so olanzapine, so that was a pin, was very attracted to H1 receptors. It is a very potent H1 receptor antagonist. That's actually the main reason why it's very sedating, because its favorite is to block H1. Compare that to, say, risperidone. You see, H1 receptors aren't really risperidone's favorite. So when you start dosing, right, you dose a drug to block D2, wow, it seems risperidone really likes D2. As compared to olanzapine, it doesn't like D2 as much. It still does, pero like risperidone likes D2 more, clearly. So when I dose risperidone to block 60% of D2, there aren't many other receptors that are going to be filled up. In fact, even though its most favorite, at least based on the 2013 data, appears to be 5-HT2A, the D2, its affinity to D2 is not quite far off. This is why, in theory, it is possible that the 5-HT2A receptors are not fully blocked at therapeutic doses of risperidone. So much so that risperidone and its sibling paliperidone, or probably its child, you would say, have higher rates of EPS and hyperprolactinemia than other second generation so-called antipsychotics. Because, again, the distance between of its favoritism, of its affinity for 5-HT2A to D2, it's pretty close. There's a reason for that. If you look at the name, for risperidone, perid comes from, it shares the same perid as haloperidol, because risperidone was actually derived from haloperidol. Both potent D2 antagonists, while they are both from different generations, risperidone's D2 antagonism is potent enough that at a therapeutic dose, perhaps not all of the 5-HT2A is blocked. And so lots of EPS relative to the other second gen. Okay, so again, it's very difficult to classify these as a homogeneous group. That's why you really need to study them as individual drugs. So when I say side effect profile, olanzapine, it's very sedating. Probably less EPS compared to risperidone. Oh yeah, there's a lot of EPS, perhaps even very, very close to first gen levels of EPS. Well, not super close, but like, you know, probably in between. Depends on the studies you look at. Between first and second gen, right? Because again, it's very potent D2 antagonist, but not as sedating. Not as sedating, because at the dose you're blocking 60% of D2 receptors, there hasn't been that much chocolate splattering at the 5-H1 receptors yet. Okay, so again, treat them as individual drugs. Okay, you can go to the book in detail to look at the receptor affinities and then compare them to, when I talk about their side effect profile. You can look at the cheat sheet also, and it will kind of make a bit more sense there. Again, using the chocolate fountain model.